You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Antennae.
Hello, welcome to episode 5 of the Penteract Poetry Podcast. My guest this time is composer, poet and YouTuber Samuel Andreyev. I met up with Samuel a few weeks ago to discuss the relationship between poetry and music, the status of both art forms, and the ways that social media have affected them. I began by asking Samuel what led him to poetry and music.
Well, it's not exactly something that I decided to do. I think that if being a musician or a poet amounts to a decision, then it's probably better to do something else. It should be something that attacks you, where sort of independently of your will, you end up having to do it. Because any reasonable person would do something else. And that's sort of what happened in my case. It was a compulsion to do this, and certainly not a decision or an act of will. And I think that it would have been extraordinarily difficult for me not to do it. And in fact, if I hadn't done it, I think it certainly would have destroyed a very large part of who I am. So it was a product of absolute necessity on every level.
Do you think that if you had a more traditional job, you'd spend too much of your spare time doing creative pursuits, that it meant that you couldn't really function in your normal job?
I've never been able to do ordinary jobs. I've made a couple of stabs at it, but not with a great deal of conviction, and with less than extraordinary success, I have to say. So I don't seem to be cut out for that sort of thing. But what I have done is I made a deal with myself very early on that this was what I was going to do, and that I was going to go all in. So I would put everything I had into it and marshal all the resources I could possibly come up with in order to make a very serious attempt at doing this. And obviously you realize that you're taking a risk when you do that, because attempting to create a life for oneself as an artist is a very high risk scenario. But it seemed to me that the risk of not doing it would be far greater. So I decided to put everything I had into it. But yeah, no, I can't do anything else really. I sort of have to do this, and so I just decided that given that I have to do this, and given that it's difficult for me to do anything else, then the best scenario for me, the best option that I have really, is to do it professionally, and try to do that well.
Yeah, and it is a risk. I'm similar to you. I did that, and I got to the age of about 26, and I realized nothing at all was happening for me. And I thought, my God, I've completely ruined my life by doing this. I should be working in a bank. What's happened? Yeah,
the first 10 years were the hardest in that respect. I can relate to what you're saying, because my 20s were difficult in that respect, definitely. Because when you're in your 20s, you're not really confirmed, either professionally or socially in many respects too. Nobody really knows what to expect from you. Nobody is, going to assume automatically that you're going to be a success at what you're trying to do. And it's very easy not to take seriously the ambitions of a young artist, because the fact is, statistically, most of them do eventually stop doing it and end up doing something else instead. And there's lots of reasons why that happens. It's an incredibly difficult field to pursue. There are excellent reasons not to do it. It's something that carries a certain stigma, I would say, for a lot of people. In other words, the idea that being an artist somehow is not a serious thing, or it's not something that you would do, past adolescence, for example. or it's something that only an extremely tiny minority of people can succeed at, and the rest should probably not try all that hard. So, the 20s were difficult, but what kept me going was a couple of things. First of all, the knowledge that this is really what I'm best at. I mean, I figured that out quite early, that this was the thing that I am here to do, to the extent that I am here to do anything. And secondly, a kind of you might say foolish stubbornness, which that can be a terrible quality to have depending on the circumstances. But in my case, it meant that I never really questioned certain axiomatic presuppositions about what I was doing with my life, and just assumed that if I applied myself enough to this one thing and did it seriously and sort of chipped away at it every day, that eventually it would yield. And that is, in fact, what happened. And that belief, or that sort of foolish stubbornness, kept me going through some very difficult periods.
So you say that there was, you thought it was what you were best at. Did you also think that you were better than other people at it? Do you have to have that idea that you could look at what other people are doing and think, well, no, I actually do, I belong here, I can do this?
I didn't think of it in terms of what other people were doing. I really focused on my own capacity for development, in the sense of here's what I'm currently able to do, here's what I would like to be able to do, here's the gap between those two things, and how do I fill that gap, and how do I keep developing as much as possible, and sort of keep acquiring skills and going in deeper and getting better at what I'm doing, and that sort of thing. That was really my focus. I suppose it did dawn on me at a certain point that this was not let's say, a typical thing to do. Although it wasn't obvious to me right away, though, because when I was 6 or 7 years old, I distinctly remember that I used to spontaneously invent melodies and sing them to myself, and sort of invent little songs and things like that, which is something that toddlers do. But I think beyond a certain age, a lot of people just either don't do it, they don't have the capacity to do it, or they don't feel like doing it, or whatever. They just don't do it. So I just assumed that everybody made up songs. But I think that's actually not the case past a certain age. And I suppose when I hit adolescence, then it became fairly clear that there was a gulf between what my ambitions were and what my interests were and what those of my peers were when I was in school. But there again, it wasn't something that I particularly was either disturbed by or interested in. I just acknowledged that there were things that were very important to me that weren't necessarily very important to other people, but I was still friends with them, and it was fine. And I sought out the company of people who were knowledgeable about the things I was interested in, which were poetry, music, painting, etc. And I sort of cultivated relationships with those sorts of people. And when you do that, it's no surprise that your social circle expands, and you eventually meet like-minded people, and things sort of go from there. And then you end up with a situation where your life is sort of centered around that activity to such an extent that it can start to seem as though this is at least a normal thing within your context. And it did appear that way for a long time, because I also went to an alternative high school in Toronto, where there were a lot of people who were either sincerely interested in culture, or at least pretended to be interested in culture. And so for most of my adolescence, I was in kind of a situation socially, at school, etc., where there were actually a fair number of people around me that took this sort of thing seriously. I guess I've been very lucky in that respect.
So you were in high school bands, for example?
I wasn't really in high school bands. I had a band of sorts, but it didn't really get going until after I'd left high school. So the time when I was in high school, I was making large numbers of home recordings. This became something of an obsession between when I was maybe, I suppose I probably started when I was about 14, and this went on until I was 21, I guess, which is when I recorded the last album that I did when I was still living in Canada. So for 6 or 7 years, I was a singer-songwriter, and I took it very seriously. I probably wrote about 150 or 200 songs during that period and recorded them at home and sort of amassed a very peculiar assortment of instruments that I used to make these recordings. And I'm not making any claims as to the intrinsic worth of these songs necessarily, but they were incredibly valuable to me in terms of developing the range of things that I could do. And they taught me a very wide range of practical skills at the same time because I had to learn to play a wide range of different instruments. I had to learn how to record. I had to learn how to work with other musicians and explain to them what my intentions were and communicate. And I had to learn how to put an album together, how to release it, all of that. And I figured those things out. And I'm not claiming that I figured them out with brilliant success, but I figured them out at a basic enough level at least so that I was able to keep doing it. And that was incredibly valuable. And all of that was 100% self-directed. There was really, I didn't have, much of an infrastructure beyond, myself and a few friends that helped out with the recordings. Until when I was probably, it's hard to pinpoint these things, but I think when I was 16 maybe, I made the acquaintance of a very fine Canadian poet by the name of Steve Venright. That's Venright. And Steve, for reasons known only to him, encountered me at this young age and felt that there was something worth supporting. And he heard some of my early songs and decided to help me continue and was immensely helpful in producing several recordings with me, which he then released through his own label, which is called Torpor Vigil Records.
So this is something you have been doing your whole life then? You can remember being 4 or 5 years old and messing around writing songs?
Yeah.
I had a keyboard that I could play about 4 notes on, and I managed to write lots of songs just using that around that age. Another thing I did, I used to design album covers. Again, at probably about 7 years old, I used to design album covers and write down the songs, even though the songs weren't written. Just make up titles and do it. Did you do that, or is that just a completely insane thing to do?
I did that too. That too. Yeah, that's funny.
Well.
Yes, I used to do that. I still have them. I have notebooks filled with projects for songs, and I would write out the titles, and I would decide what the running order would be, side A, side B, and so on. And I that's actually quite funny to hear that somebody else did that as well.
I found some the other day, and one of the titles was a song called Dr. Metal, brackets long version. So the long version of Dr. Metal.
Yeah, see, I didn't come up with anything quite as arresting as Dr. Metal, but I recall when I was 14, I wrote what in my mind was an epic experimental poem called The Brief Evening, and it was one of these things. It was like
title, actually.
I still can't fathom exactly what this was meant to point to. But I think it's a very fine example of sort of an adolescent cartoon version of what experimental poetry is meant to be. So anyway, I was writing poetry throughout this entire period, starting from when I was about 13. And so the music and the poetry were things that developed simultaneously and with very little of a boundary between the two, I would say.
Well, when I approached you about doing this podcast, I said it would be good to discuss poetry and music because they're so closely related. And you said they're the same thing, which sounded quite a bold statement to me.
I can't for the life
believe
of
that?
Yeah, I do believe it. I can't for the life of me I mean, there's way more points in common than differences, substantive differences. So, and certainly having invested profoundly in both, um, they they seem very, very close to me. Uh, when you're a poet, you're concerned with rhythm, you're concerned with meter, you're concerned with sound, you're concerned with meaning, you're concerned with structure, you're concerned with pattern, and these elements are all present in music as well. I would say that perhaps one slight difference is that when you're reading a poem, reading is a very interesting act, especially with regards to poetry, because I don't know how other people read poetry, but in my case, it's very rare that I will read it starting from the first word all the way to the end and without any repetitions, just sort of read one line, read the next line, and so on and so on, like the way sort of a robot or a machine might scan a text. What I will tend to do is read a line and then stop, and then I might read it again, and then I'll think about it, and then I'll read the next line, and then I might skip ahead, and then I might go backwards again, and then I might compare this line with the line that I read 3 pages ago, and so on. And I'll sort of zigzag through the poem, and I might do it in such a manner that the temporal flow of the poem is constantly speeding up and slowing down or stopping. So in other words, it's anything but a straight line. And in music, I mean, when you're an audience member sitting and listening to a piece, you are a prisoner in a certain sense of the necessity to hear the piece unfold in real time, right? You can't really stop and pause over a passage and hear it again. You sort of can in your mind's ear, so to speak, but during the act of performance, you sit down, the piece starts, and then you have to wait for it to finish. Where it gets interesting for me in musical terms, and it's the same in poetry also, is that I often have the sense that the real sort of mental work, so to speak, of engaging with the poem or with the piece of music occurs afterwards. It occurs after you've read the poem. It occurs after you've listened to the piece, and it becomes a kind of potential landscape within your mind that you can revisit and you can contemplate, and you can see it as a thing that you can engage with without the necessity of actually sitting there and reading the words or sitting there and listening to the sounds unfold across time. It becomes an almost atemporal thing, and that's for me the point at which it becomes really exciting. I would hesitate to generalize about other people's experiences listening to pieces of music, partly because in the course of the work that I do with YouTube, but I also do a lot of public speaking, and I've been doing a tour around France, meeting high school students and talking to them about what I do. And what I've noticed actually is that no two people do listen in the same manner. There are certain generalities you can say, which is that I think that one thing that a lot of let's say non-professional musicians have trouble with is that it's difficult for them to understand a piece of music in terms of its being a trajectory, or in terms of its having a trajectory, which is to say that the piece starts somewhere, it takes you on a particular journey, and there are stops along the way, and the landscape has features, and then you end up somewhere else at the time that the piece is over. In other words, I can see a piece as a kind of, well, I could conceptualize it either as a piece of architecture, as a kind of a static visual design, but I can also imagine it as a landscape through which you travel. And whereas I think that a lot of people don't necessarily encounter a piece of music as being a journey, or as having a trajectory. Rather, they will pick out individual moments and they'll say, "Well, I enjoyed the flute solo," or "That was really cool when the tom-toms started playing." Or I really, that was so cool when the double bass started doing that, whatever. In other words, they'll pick out individual moments that they noticed and that they found striking, but they won't connect them to each other in terms of an overall trajectory. So that's one thing that I've noticed. But beyond that general point, people do listen in surprisingly varied ways.
Because I wonder how that applies to poetry then. As a poet, I do worry that there'll be a line in one of my poems that ruins the whole thing for everybody. You can't have one bad line because it'll ruin the whole piece.
It's the same in stand-up comedy in the extent that you're only as good as your worst line. I think that's true in poetry as well. And one thing I've mentioned before is that I think that if you want to, well, anyone who aspires to be a serious composer or a poet, I think, should listen to the masters of stand-up comedy, because the best ones they'll knock your socks off. They're amazing. Like, they can go for an hour, not make a single mistake, have perfect timing, incredible delivery. The whole thing will be so funny that you almost can't stand it, and there won't be a single bad line anywhere. And it's like, that's something that a composer should aspire to. You should be able to write a piece that is so tight, in which every element is so necessary, that it's just like it's an absolute pleasure listening to it from beginning to end, and there's not even a second where you don't feel fully engaged with it. Now, obviously, that also presupposes a kind of ideal listener, but I think that that is something to aim for, and I certainly also think that it's something to aim for in poetry. It should be gripping. It shouldn't be a slog, and a lot of poetry is a slog.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I lean towards formalism, because really the parameters are set out for you. You have to hit this mark and this mark and this mark, and then you'll even have in some forms, like the triolet form, which is one of my favorites. You really don't have that many words to write, so so you can really focus on getting each word right.
Well, one thing that was, I think, quite important in terms of shaping my sensibility when I was growing up was I was very enthusiastic about cartoonists and comic strips, especially newspaper comic strips, and something about the constraints involved in producing them. I didn't care about whether they were funny or not. In fact, the jokes were completely, of almost no interest generally. But I loved the feeling of rhythm, the necessity of extreme compression, the need to create these almost iconic visual vocabularies in which a very simple symbol or a squiggly line or a dot can take the place of a much more complicated visual marker. And taking all of these elements that are hyper compressed and putting them together into something that can carry some kind of meaning or emotion, I found actually extraordinarily impressive. And one of the most extreme examples of that sort of compression are the comics that you would get wrapped around bubblegum, Bazooka Joe and those sorts of things, and which are objectively some of the worst comics in the world. They're kind of hilariously awful, but in a way that I actually found quite stimulating to contemplate. And in those, you would have maybe 3 panels at the most, and maybe 15 words, something like that. I mean, it was completely telegraphic. It had to be something that you could consume in 1 second, and that would be it. And I actually have a great deal of affection for those sorts of formats, where it's like instantaneous message delivery, instantaneous gag delivery, or whatever it might be, and it has to work. It has to hit its target, and you don't have any room to fail. So that's something that I still bear in mind when I'm writing my music today.
In the second podcast, I talked to Stephen J. Fowler, and we had a conversation where we both expressed our awkward relationship with the term avant-garde, and I suppose with being experimental in general. What do you think of that term, avant-garde?
It's a difficult question to answer, because the term avant-garde means a lot of things to me simultaneously. In a musical context, I suppose it's hard for me not to associate it with the immediate post-war period in Europe. And it's a term that really points to a very specific historical period. And I don't think we're in that historic moment anymore. I think that what's happening now in composition is very, very far removed from that. And one of the sort of central ideas of the avant-garde is the notion that you are doing something that is sort of exploring new territory, and you're sort of positing a dialectic between what's already been done and what is yet to be done, and you're sort of exploring the frontier land, so to speak. I think that's basically what any creative artist does. So
Yeah.
for me, a genuine act of artistic creation involves, as a matter of course, exploring new territory. So to that extent, I suppose I'm an avant-gardist. But in terms of the, let's say, well, this really has to do with the associations that this term has historically, and in terms of music, it has to do certainly with the reaction to Romanticism, with a desire to enter into a sort of deliberately conflictual relationship with the audience, to do things that would be shocking, that would cause an upset, and so on. And those have never been major motivating factors for me. Obviously, I prefer that my pieces elicit a strong reaction, because there's nothing worse than a sort of lukewarm reaction to a piece of art. It's like, why even bother? If it's just like a kind of, if it was just another thing to trip over in the world, then you're better off doing something else, I think. So it needs to elicit a strong resonance, a strong reaction. I remember there's a comment that when the Velvet Underground's first album came out, it sold very few copies, but everybody who bought a copy went out and started a band. I think that's the best compliment an artist can have. If it makes you want to do something in response, if it makes you want to make something yourself, that's an extraordinary compliment.
Yeah.
So it should be productive in that sense. This is a very long-winded answer to your question about the avant-garde. But I would certainly never describe myself as an avant-garde artist.
Yeah, I think where I ended up thinking about this was avant-garde works exist, but I'm not sure avant-garde people do. I don't think of myself as an avant-garde artist, because as much as I will experiment with lots of things and try to come up with very new things, things no one's done before, at the same time, I'm just as happy writing a sonnet, a very traditional poem.
That's partly a question of context. You could argue that writing a sonnet today is a somewhat provocative act in relationship to what's going on in the vast majority of the poetry world. The other point I would say about that is that a lot of composers who are thought of as being sort of hardcore revolutionary / avant-garde figures, if you engage deeply enough with their work and read their letters and read their biographies and so on, it's very rare that you'll find a figure who actually thought of themselves as a revolutionary or thought of themselves as an avant-garde artist. In most cases, they actually thought that what they were doing was completely normal. And I find that actually to be incredibly interesting. In other words, they would think, well, this is, it's not that it's avant-garde. This is normal. This is what you would expect to happen, given the particular cultural moment, given the things that have happened before. Obviously, this is a direction that you would explore, without a sense of I'm being revolutionary. It's just this is a completely normal reaction to this particular moment in history. And that just comes back to the Ezra Pound quote, which I like, which is that the artist is the antennae of the human race. In other words, the artist is just sort of picking up on things that are there. They're there in plain sight for everybody to see, but that everyone isn't necessarily noticing as being potential agents of expression in the world, and picking those things up and amplifying them and putting them into a kind of a sensual form so that you can engage with them immediately.
I think one of the problems with the idea of avant-gardism is that it is such a 20th century thing. It almost suggests that there weren't experimental artists before then.
Of course, I mean, Bach was experimental. Mozart created experiments. There are experiments all throughout the music of Haydn, all throughout the music. Well, Beethoven is just one gigantic experiment from beginning to end. So, like when you consider the history of composition, it's hard to think of a major figure, like a really major figure who wasn't experimental to the tips of their fingers.
I'm glad you mentioned Bach because there was a tweet you did, I think it was about 2 years ago now, which I loved, where you found a definition of postmodern music and you've shared it and with the comments, all of this could be applied to Bach. I think, I'm with you on this. I don't know what postmodern music is, if it's
Yeah,
anything.
yeah, I don't either. I bought a book about the topic because I thought maybe it would provide some enlightenment. Because these are terms that are thrown around. This is a piece of postmodern poetry. This is postmodern painting. This is postmodern a piece of music, and so on. It's extremely rare that you ever see anybody be actually cornered and asked to specify precisely what they mean by postmodern, especially with regards to composition. And so I got a book on the topic, which is called Postmodern Music / Postmodern Thought. I believe that's the title. And leafed through it, and the introduction was hilarious because it actually declined to define the very topic of the book itself. In other words, I think one of the very opening phrases in the book was, "It is impossible to define postmodern music," or something like this, which is an inauspicious start for a book that claims to be about that topic. And then it went on to provide a long sort of laundry list of qualities that it felt postmodern music needed to exhibit. Well, also sort of there's a lot of hand waving, and of course it's not an exhaustive list, and many of these qualities won't be present, and so on. And what it seems to have had to do with was sort of willingness to take elements from the past and recombine them was one aspect.
Which every artist does.
Which every artist does, like admitting for a kind of sort of heterogeneity in terms of the elements that go into the work. I'm trying to use of quotation, mixing of high and low, and these sorts of things. And like, it was an absurd list because all these are all things that Bach did, So I'm fairly convinced at this point that in terms of composition, it really doesn't mean anything. There are lots of bad pieces that do those things and do them very badly and in a very obvious way, where you can sort of figure them out in 2 seconds. And some of those sorts of pieces get labeled as postmodern, but I mean, to me, they're just bad compositions. So I don't really think it means all that much at all.
It's actually very hard to think of any poetry or music, even bad stuff, that doesn't, to some extent, use most of the things that are in that list, good or bad. You're definitely going to be relying on things that have been done before, and you're definitely going to create something that hasn't been done before.
Well, I think it might be better, it might be more sensible to point out that there was a period within high modernism in which music attempted to create these utopian self-contained languages. In other words, the piece would establish its own grammar and would adhere to it very strictly and would have a very narrow focus as to what it would be, what elements it would be using. So you wouldn't have heterogeneous elements in a piece like that. The piece would be highly self-similar and highly self-contained and highly self-referential and hermetic, basically. And there were a lot of high modernist pieces of music that functioned that way. So I suppose on one level, you could say that some of the trends that emerged in composition and starting in the 1970s, let's say, onwards, that did have to do with mixing heterogeneous elements in a composition, mixing high and low and all of that sort of thing. I suppose you could argue that that's new with respect to the, actually quite short-lived period of high modernism as it existed in the composition world. But that's to ignore the entire rest of music history. So I suspect that, the postmodern music idea arose in reaction to the perceived dominance of the high modernist style as it existed in composition for, let's say, maybe 30 years.
Yeah, but I don't buy it.
Yeah, no, it's not convincing. It's not convincing. And look, these are they're trivial questions because I think like an artist that is doing something with real engagement and is actually inventing something is not going to have a lot of time for labels, generally speaking. So
It's like the avant-garde thing, isn't it? It's useful if you can find it useful, but otherwise there's no need.
Yeah, I would agree
Uh,
with that.
but so anyway, what we call avant-garde, let's stick with the label while it's useful. I'm interested in something you've done a video on, which is how close popular music and avant-garde or art music have been in the past, and how that relationship has changed.
Yeah, one thing that I think is incredibly important throughout the classical period, the Baroque also, and to some extent in Romanticism, is the presence of a sort of a subterranean layer of the vernacular that seeps through into this sort of elevated art music realm. And you can't really have one without the other. I mean, they exist in this interesting sort of symbiosis, which is to say that the basic rhythmic patterns that you get in almost all classical music are derived from dances, and the dances are not sort of I mean, these are real dances, like things that you would theoretically dance to, and that whole rhythmic language comes from there. The melodic content of a lot of classical music is also fundamentally popular in character. What is maybe not popular is the sort of complicated developments that exist in that music, the often quite sophisticated harmonic trajectories, and the counterpoint, and the way that different layers are combined in a piece, and the dialectical dimension of classical music, where you have sort of multiple opposing themes or harmonic regions that enter into a dialogue with each other, and all of these sorts of elements are not popular elements, but there are also a lot of sort of materials directly stemming from vernacular music that are present in it. And this was just a sort of normal state of affairs. Certainly Bach quoted popular tunes in his music, and he used Lutheran hymn tunes throughout his entire career as the basis of his cantatas, his liturgical music, his organ music, all sorts of things. So, I mean, this was the equivalent of sort of popular everyday songs that everybody would know. And he would weave these into the most ridiculously sophisticated feats of contrapuntal virtuosity that you can imagine. I mean, these are just sort of spellbinding accomplishments, but that use these sort of very humble everyday materials as their starting point. And I find that just extraordinary that he did that. This started to change towards the second half of the 19th century, where you started to have a much wider gap between the popular and the sort of art music circles. And particularly with Wagner, you start to get a kind of irreconcilable breach between the two, where on the one hand, sort of popular music no longer wants anything to do with this sort of turgid, overly serious, exaggeratedly complicated and thick art music. And on the other hand, this art music that views itself as being sublime and elevated and sort of existing in a kind of celestial realm, far from the sort of muck and the sort of primordial, unsophisticated sort of popular realm. And you get this sort of mutual disdain starting to solidify between these two camps. And this I see as a sort of a very unfortunate development in a lot of respects. And somehow this situation became basically normal for wide swaths of the music world well until the 1970s and beyond. And you could actually argue that for a very large number of composers, it's still the case. In other words, there's a kind of disdain for the popular. There's a kind of feeling that this is somehow something that should be avoided. and a sort of insistence on some kind of aesthetic purity.
Certainly in the 60s and 70s, there was an art music influence on some very big commercial artists. Frank Zappa, for example, or the Beatles, in fact.
That was an extraordinary time. I mean, it would have been naive to expect that to continue forever, because it's not a normal state of affairs. One thing that I think is very interesting, it's extremely rare, but there are occasional flashes in music history where a very elevated, sophisticated style suddenly coincides with a popular style, and they sort of collide in this brilliant flash, and they produce work that is simultaneously highly accessible, but also incredibly sophisticated and sort of technically extraordinary and on many levels. It happened with Mozart. Like, Mozart actually created a style that marries the most sophisticated sort of compositional technology, if you want to use that term, with the most direct sort of popular expression, and the two coexist in his work. Even Beethoven couldn't achieve that. There are works of Beethoven that are seriously recondite. They're difficult. They really, you can't just sort of throw them on and enjoy them casually. With Mozart, you have these different levels that seem to exist simultaneously in the same piece, where on the one level, it's a serious object of contemplation. In other words, you could spend a very long time trying to tease out all of the subtleties and complexities, all the richness, all of the extraordinary qualities of this work, and you could hear it hundreds of times and keep discovering new things in it. And at the same time, there will be a level of the immediate encounter with the work that is extremely seductive and appealing and accessible. And that's like a kind of a perfect, what would you say, totally unexpected bridging of those two things. You see a related, although different, phenomenon in the temporary crossing of the avant-garde with some of the popular music artists in the 1960s, as you mentioned. This is a similarly unexpected, brilliant, short little flash that had profound reverberations, I think, and that certainly, for me, were incredibly important. I mean, there are so many examples of this. I mean, you mentioned the Beatles. Pretty much any track from Sgt. Pepper, from Magical Mystery Tour, the White Album, has some form of experimental dimension to it, or like with very few exceptions. Something
I wonder
like,
with them. I think with them, maybe it was just a consequence that they really could do whatever the hell they wanted by that point. There was no fear.
I don't think that accounts for it, because there are lots of people who, given the opportunity to do whatever they wanted, would produce lots of sort of banal iterations on the same basic patterns. You have to have the capacity for invention and the curiosity to want to try new things. There have been bands who have been in a similar position of like complete economic dominance and artistic dominance, where they could throw their weight around. They could impose demands upon the record labels and push their vision through, and they ended up doing incredibly banal things. So I think there's a little bit more to it than that. I do believe that the interest that John Lennon and Paul McCartney in particular had in the avant-garde was sincere. I think that they were quite sincere in how they engaged with it. There's no reason to doubt that, really. I mean, they were listening to Stockhausen and things like this, and taking it seriously, and producing things like Revolution 9. And that is an absolutely extraordinary cultural moment. It's not just the Beatles. You mentioned Zappa. There's certainly Captain Beefheart. You could argue that groups such as the Doors, for example, were doing it in a different respect as well. There were lots of people doing this. I think part of it was also that the music industry, so to speak, was a relatively new thing at that point. And Zappa describes the fact that in the sort of early days of the sort of album industry, the pop album industry, the executives literally had no idea what would sell and what wouldn't sell, what would be of interest to teenage consumers and what wouldn't. So they were just willing to try things. The music industry was extremely faddish at that point, so you would have these weird trends that would happen and sell 1 million albums, and then you'd pass on to something else. There was a kind of a spirit of, well, let's try this and see what happens, and see if it, just throw it and see if it sticks to the wall, kind of thing. So there was a kind of very heuristic, kind of experimental approach on not only on the part of the artist, but also the executives running the labels to try these things. There are all kinds of completely off the wall, one of a kind, unreproducible, albums that were produced in many different directions around that time. Once the industry started to figure out formulas for success that were relatively, what would you say, bankable, relatively things that they could be fairly sure would work and fairly sure would not work. Things started to coalesce around a much narrower range of possibilities.
Yeah. Well, what about poetry then? In the 60s and 70s, record producers didn't know what to do. They didn't know what would work, so they tried everything. Surely poetry is in a position to do that now, because nothing is working. This should be the heyday for experimental poetry, because why not? So experimental poetry doesn't sell a lot, but neither does mainstream poetry. So this should be the time to maybe see what happens, see what works.
Maybe you can provide some enlightenment for me, because I don't actually understand the mainstream poetry world at all. Like I understand that, for example, for poets, it's a big deal to get published in a magazine like the New Yorker. It's a big deal to have a poem in the New Yorker. Which, I mean, I can't read the poems in the New Yorker. I literally, after one line, I have to stop. It's like I've never actually found one where I could get past the first line. So there's a weird sort of gap in my eyes, anyway, between the sorts of things that tend to get published in supposedly, high impact, highly prestigious organs of dissemination, and their complete lack of interest, at least for me, and what I would certainly perceive also as being a complete lack of impact on the wider culture. Conversely, you have poets doing things on Twitter that are incredibly striking for me, and that I would imagine have also, at least potentially, a much wider impact and a much wider readership. So I can't square the strange disconnect between the sort of official prestige involved in some of these outlets and just their, I think, almost insane irrelevance at the same time. How can something be prestigious and absurdly irrelevant simultaneously?
It's because poetry is unpopular, which means it's very easy for people to take over the poetry world and present the kind of poetry they want to, for often political reasons, often in terms of maintaining some sort of status quo. Do I go on? How much trouble should I get myself into? But you're right. Certainly that it's really insufferable poetry that's getting the most attention.
Well, look, it gets the most institutional attention, but that I think it's important to make a distinction. It's like the distinction between a journalist wanting to get an exciting new story into a newspaper and the editor who determines ultimately what ends up on the front page. It's like it's two different things. And I do find there's a weird sort of institutional insistence on maintaining this bizarre status quo of what poetry should look like, that is just completely at odds with what certainly anybody I know and I know, a surprisingly varied range of people. What anybody I know would be actually compelled by, or would actually want to spend time reading. And it strikes like there has to be an element of desperation behind that. This desperation to maintain at all costs this facade that poetry is this sort of genteel, kind of harmless thing that sort of makes you scratch your beard and go, that sort of thing, which for me is the precise exact opposite of what I want poetry to be.
What you can take some comfort in is that the existence of things like Twitter and Instagram really annoys these people.
Yeah. Well, that's
take some pleasure in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Twitter is one of the most compelling and extraordinary innovations that mankind has produced in any form over the past 30 years or so. I think Twitter's amazing.
And poetry needs it. Poetry needs it because, as I said, even mainstream poetry doesn't actually get that much attention.
Right.
There still is not a lot of exposure for any kind of poetry. So we need things like Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. So there we are. That brings me on to the next topic.
Well, yes. I mean, what I would say about that, since we're talking about social media versus the sort of standard sort of officially prestigious organs that exist, I think that if you're the sort of artist, composer, poet, writer, whatever it might be, who is investing a great deal of energy into sort of trying to force their way through that tiny little narrow door of maybe getting a piece published in a magazine, or having a collection be put out by a major publisher or something like that. Like in other words, this is like a tiny little aperture, and you've got like thousands and thousands and thousands of people desperately trying to squeeze their way through it, and it's completely saturated and blocked, right? And it's like you have like a 1 in a million chance that you can even stick your finger through it. And then on the other hand, it's like if you just like shift your attention 5 degrees to the left, there's this massive open gate, where it's like anything's possible. It just requires just the slightest shift in your attention. And I just don't get why more people don't make that shift, because Twitter, YouTube, all of these different platforms, if you sort of have even a very modest amount of ability to use these platforms well, the amount of leverage you can get through them is like vastly, like several orders of magnitude greater than what you could get even if you managed to sort of squeeze through that completely saturated, clogged up portal made grubby by untold numbers of people trying to do all sorts of unseemly things to squeeze their way through it.
Well, we talked earlier about the risk you take going into this lifestyle, and I found myself at the age of 34. I had about 2 readers, one I was married to, and I'm not in academia, so I didn't have that. I don't live in a big city, so I didn't have that way of getting into any sort of poetry scene, and I certainly didn't know any other poets who'd been published. So I was kind of in big trouble then. So I started a Twitter account, and it's done huge things for me. So my own personal experience is that I could not have done this otherwise. I could not have got anywhere otherwise. And I'm proud to say I have nearly 3,000 Twitter followers. But you have how many YouTube subscribers?
Just under 27,000.
Okay, so you win. But your YouTube channel has been amazing. You must be very proud of that.
Yeah, I am proud of it. I think what I'm most proud of is sort of reaching people that would not have had the opportunity or the means to discover some of the things that I talk about otherwise. The world of contemporary composition is, in many respects, actually a surprisingly small world, surprisingly incestuous one, and very inward-looking a lot of the time. which is to say that the prizes that a lot of people will go after are, the things we've already talked about, the sort of major institutional prizes and those sorts of things, which actually have very little impact in terms of the real world. And there are vast numbers of people who are actually way more open than you might think, than you might give them credit for, who simply lack the opportunity, the sort of context, the sort of base level familiarity or knowledge to engage with these things, but that would happily do so if the bar for entry were made very low. And by making the bar for entry low, what I simply mean is, not asking them to spend money on a concert ticket, not asking them to spend money on a CD, not asking them to spend 30 hours reading a complicated book, but just present in a straightforward manner a compelling case for why it might be worth your time to listen to this or that piece of 20th century music, or whatever it might be. And I started the YouTube channel as an experiment because I had absolutely no expectations for it whatsoever. I had just finished a period of teaching teaching music analysis in a conservatory in northern France, and so I had a certain amount of pedagogical experience that I was a little bit frustrated with, because I think when it was at its greatest extent, my class had maybe 15 students, something like that. So I'd be putting an enormous amount of effort into preparing these lectures and doing these complicated analyses of pieces of music. Then, maybe there'd be 10 people there that day, and then next week you'd do something else, and so on. And it's like, it'd be much better, it'd be infinitely more optimal if these things that I've prepared could be made accessible to a much larger number of people. Because, what's not to discount the importance of that sort of one-to-one type of education, which I still think is also very important. But it just seemed like if you're going to go to the level of effort that I went to in preparing those courses, you might as well just try to make it available and see what happens. So I started making like ridiculously crude, like embarrassingly crude videos. It was just literally myself. This shows you how little skill and imagination I had at this point. It's just I would literally just film myself in my office as though I were giving a lecture in a classroom, and on whatever topic. And then I would have these completely unedited videos that I had done in one take with the like really lousy, low quality equipment. Just throw them on YouTube and think, okay, maybe 10 people will watch this, and that'd be kind of fun. Then I'll have doubled the number of people that will have heard this lecture. So I did one on the composer Morton Feldman in late 2016, and very quickly, in a matter of a few days, it had something like 1,000 views. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I was not expecting that at all. And then it just kept going from there, and the views just kept increasing. And it really did take me by surprise. And it was an indication to me that the level of public interest in compelling, interesting art and music explained in an engaging way is way higher than we think. Like if me, with my sort of crappy setup, my complete technological lack of sophistication, my naive amateurish attempts at producing videos with very little effort can get thousands and thousands of views, then that tells you something. That tells you, first of all, that the mainstream media are completely out to lunch with regards to all of these things. They don't understand their importance. They don't understand how to talk about them. They don't think it's important. And it also tells you that people are way sharper and more curious and more interested in these things than they get credit for. And a lot of I started getting letters from all over the world, like literally all over the world, the most improbable places, from people saying that these videos had reached them somehow. I have no idea how they found them. That it showed them an entire new world that they didn't know existed, and that they were grateful for that. And that bowled me over. I was astounded. Here I am, just sitting in my office like I would do normally, and suddenly I've got the entire world sending me letters. I mean, it's crazy.
My own personal experience is it's helped me a lot. But as you know, I'm not a novice when it comes to music, but I'm also not an expert. So it's very good for someone like me because I didn't already know a lot of these things that you presented in your videos. I feel like I should have, which is probably a sign that there hasn't been enough about it elsewhere.
Yeah, there's a kind of vacuum around it. I think part of the reason for that is that there is a public perception that let's call it contemporary composition, or at least music since 1945, is a subject for specialists or for highly specialized audiences. Let's put it that way, and that it's a complicated, demanding thing that's hard to enjoy, and that you need to know a lot about in order to appreciate. And having spoken with large numbers of people who are not specialists, I can say that they often evoke the same trepidation around this subject, which is that they're concerned that if they go to a concert, they will have no idea what they're listening to. They won't know how to judge it. They won't be able to tell if it's good or bad. They'll have no context for it. And it's very hard to enjoy something if you have no idea what you're hearing, and if you can't relate it to something else. And so it just seemed to me that an obvious thing to do would be to sort of create links with things that might already be familiar from other contexts, and that very often helps people to sort of drop their inhibitions and just enter into the world of a piece. It doesn't take much. It actually takes very, very little in order to facilitate that sense of engagement. But it was cruelly lacking for a very long time. And part of that is institutional and structural in nature. A lot of it is also, I would say, the result of composers not really knowing how to communicate, or at least communicating in an extremely insular way around what they were doing, where you would get composers publishing very complex theoretical analytical articles on their own work or on the work of other composers in specialist journals that had very, very restricted readerships, not necessarily presenting the ideas of their work in a straightforward, accessible fashion, and not really showing much interest in doing that either. So this will inevitably shift with given the colossal power of social media platforms.
I hope so, and I hope it does for poetry too, because there is certainly the same problem there. I mean, I know poets who don't know the basics of prosody, and if they don't, then I'm sure most non-poets don't. And it's worrying because if you know these things, it does help your appreciation of poetry.
Yeah, this is what I've tried to do in composition, and the first video is also, I think, like I didn't attempt to simplify things beyond a certain limit. In other words, if a piece was complex, I would reveal the complexity of the piece. I wouldn't try to cover it up and say, well, actually it's it's a very straightforward thing. Here's what it is, and here's 3 sort of zippy lines about the piece that will allow you to. It's like acknowledging the fact that this is demanding, this is challenging, this takes a bit of an investment, and taking the time to present it properly so that you can actually see what the artist is attempting to do. I think there's often a kind of reticence around that, around revealing the extent of the complexity, you might say, of a particular artistic language. A sort of fear that this will drive people away. I haven't found that to be the case at all. I occasionally get comments on YouTube from people saying things like, the pace of this video was too fast for me, or there were too many terms I didn't know, and I didn't want to have to keep stopping and looking them up or whatever. But the vast majority of people that I hear from will say, okay, there might have been a word or two that I wasn't familiar with, but like, you just press pause, type it into Google. It's like, this is not rocket science. Like, anyone can do this. If there's a word you don't know, you Google it and go on the Wikipedia page, whatever. It'll. So And I mean, this is just an everyday skill for most people. So it's hard to take seriously the complaint that, well, I didn't know this, I didn't know this term, therefore, the video was lost on me. It's like, well, you can't take that very seriously. And most people aren't like that. So I find it's better to present the work in a way that is not sort of dumbing it down, just explains what it is. And if people need to listen to the video twice, which some people do, some people listen to them multiple times, they tell me, or they need to stop and look up the words, that's also part of the engagement. And there's a certain enjoyment, I think, that can come from that.
Yeah, it's part of any learning process, isn't it? If you're reading a book and you don't understand what's in the sentence, you read the sentence again.
Well, if I were to try to make a video where every single viewer would be guaranteed to understand every word and every term, I'm trying to imagine what that would actually look like.
It would be longer. Probably,
yeah. Well, it would be comical. Like it would be ridiculous. And you can't do that. So like the other thing is, like, YouTube videos are not, at least my videos are not addressed to a particular demographic or audience. Like when I'm making a video, I have no idea who I'm addressing. I don't know who I'm talking to. The person at the other end could be, a professor with 50 years of experience, or it could be a 14-year-old. I have no idea. And the way that my approach has evolved has just been to assume that the person that I'm talking to is curious, that they're reasonably intelligent, and that they want to know more about the subject. And then you just go from there. It's going to be above some people's heads, I suppose, but I think that's really a minority of viewers.
I would say so. I think if in the first place you're going to it, then you have some sort of intellectual curiosity, which probably suggests that you're able to grasp it.
One thing that I have noticed on YouTube, which is, I mean, as a platform, it's very different from Twitter, obviously, in many respects. But one thing, you do now have fairly large numbers of professional YouTubers. In other words, people who make their living primarily through producing content on YouTube and financing it through Patreon, through advertising, and through other means. In order to make a channel like that, you probably need to have a subscriber base in at least the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions of viewers, which is obviously far from being my situation. And what tends to happen is when you get a channel to that level, there often tends to be a high level of homogenization of the content. In other words, the videos will rapidly start to look like the videos of everybody else who is pursuing that model. They'll have approximately the same duration, 10 minutes, around 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but it tends to sort of gravitate around that. They'll be very fast-paced, a lot of really, really fast editing. There'll be a lot of visual, graphic elements, animations, and so on and so forth. There will be a particular style of presentation, a particular type of vocabulary that will be sort of intended to be immediately familiar and engaging, and so on and so forth. And I'm certainly not knocking those people by any means, because I think there's tremendous value to be had from taking complicated subject matter and simplifying it and rendering it accessible and entertaining. I have the greatest respect for people who can do that well. So this is by no means a critique, but that's not the sort of content I'm interested in producing for multiple reasons. I don't have the patience. I'm not interested in spending a lot of my time editing videos. I have a lot of other things to do. And I don't want to compress everything down into a 5 or a 10 minute sort of simplified version. So my videos are a little bit more discursive. They take longer to introduce the subject matter. I draw other things into it, and they're not as tightly edited. But that's just a choice. That's something that I can. Doing them that way is something that I can integrate into my life a lot more easily, and it's just what I'm comfortable doing.
Yeah, we've been eulogizing social media, but I suppose this is one of the downsides, that you can end up chasing, or on Twitter chasing likes, or on YouTube chasing listens.
Yeah, I think that the likes and so on will come as a result of having created something valuable, something that actually improves the lives of people that encounter it. If you can do that somehow, if you can make their lives a little bit better, uh, I think that has to be the ultimate goal on some level. It's like I can choose to focus people's attention on something that's actually enriching, interesting, compelling, makes your life a little bit better in some respect. And that's the ultimate goal of everything I do. And if you can do that, then people will tend to respond to that, just as a matter of course. So producing kind of hollow content that is sort of formatted in a way so as to sort of suck as many eyeballs as possible towards it. Uh, that can certainly work in the short term. I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing for the world or even a sustainable long-term strategy.
At least Twitter isn't monetized, which is a bad thing in some ways, but maybe there's a positive.
Well, it depends on what you mean by monetized, right? Because these things can have ancillary effects that are very difficult to quantify. So, I mean, you mentioned the fact that your readership expanded dramatically as a result of Twitter, and that you
Yeah,
found
I owe over 90% of my book sales to Twitter, I think.
right. So Twitter isn't monetized, but I mean, in your case, like this is a spectacular example of a poet, finding a substantial audience as a result of this, and then that audience, their engagement will not be limited to Twitter. They might then go out and attend a reading or buy a book or whatever it might be. It's been that's been my experience as well. So it's very very hard to very hard to put terms around that, right? Because the expansion of my opportunities as an artist, my sort of what you might call uh, my public profile, the curve of that expansion very neatly corresponds with the curve of my engagement with social media. So,
Yeah.
Correlation is not causation, as they say, but in this case, it's fairly clear that there's a connection between the two. And as I got better at working in that world of social media, my opportunities continued to expand. Now, once again, I think if the content had not been there, if I had not actually been doing anything particularly engaging or compelling or valuable, then I don't know if it would have worked. And I'm not making the argument that I've succeeded in that. But to the extent that it has succeeded on a modest scale, I'd like to think that it's because there is some degree of value in the things that I've put up.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Thank you.
And we will. I'll put a link to your YouTube channel in the description here, but I probably don't need to because it's so popular.
What about poets on YouTube? What's your is that a thing? Is that a
Not
substantial
really.
outlet?
I don't really see too much on YouTube. I mean, something like what you do would be quite useful, I think. A real analytical approach, but especially going up, being selfish and thinking about my interests. It would be nice to see some videos that really teach about formal poetry.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, it seems to be one of the favorite outlets of writers. It's not so popular with musicians. Very few of my sort of composer acquaintances and friends are active on Twitter. They don't seem to gravitate to that particular platform. Whereas for me, it's become increasingly important. And I mean, I have comparatively quite few Twitter followers. I mean, it's not in terms of numbers, it's nothing like the YouTube channel. But I get tremendous value out of the platform personally. And I suppose it's logical that writers would be more into Twitter and musicians would be more into YouTube.
Well, it's good for poetry, I suppose, because poems tend to be short. I've always found the problem with Twitter is that people don't click on links.
Hmm. Yeah, the engagement rate tends not to be as high as you might think. Yeah, they have a thing on Twitter analytics called impressions, right? You're I love that term. It sort of immediately brings to mind an image of a beam of light flashing across an eyeball or something like this. You know, it's
It's not
like,
an actual read, it's an impression. Yeah. Someone had the impression of reading it.
yeah, I read a book by Merleau-Ponty on phenomenology, the phenomenology of perception, in which he takes an enormous amount of time defining the term impression as distinct from sensation and what these terms actually mean. So it's quite funny to see that the term impression has been sort of turned into a major uh, sort of statistic in terms of Twitter, as opposed to the engagement, which means you've actually, you've performed an action, you've clicked on something, or you've, you know,
Yeah.
I find that quite funny.
Yeah, I keep, being something of a nerd. I do look at my analytics a lot. But it can be quite depressing in some ways. That my most successful tweet ever had 7,000 likes, but it had 1.5 million impressions. So I looked at that, looked at that as a percentage and thought, well, that's no good.
Yeah, you know what I think? I have a theory about this, and this is by no means a tested theory, and it's probably wrong. But I suspect that people have a kind of a like budget, right? Which is to say that there's a certain amount of time that you will press the like button, and beyond that point, you don't want to seem like you're giving it away. Do you know what I mean? Like you don't want to sort of dilute your credibility as a person of discernment by liking every single tweet that comes across your feed, right? So you might like as a matter of course, without even thinking about it, maybe like 1% or less of the tweets that you see, just and there might also be a sort of form of like fatigue because it requires a modest amount of physical effort to actually click the mouse or whatever it might be.
Well, I mean, surely it varies from person to person. Some people are very loose with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas some
But yeah,
some don't like to be liking more than one thing a day.
oh yeah, but I've often had the feeling like, well, I don't know, I've already liked 5 things today. It's like maybe that's maybe that's enough. It's like, well, this tweet really is great, but I mean, yeah, but I want to like a sixth thing. So yeah, I wonder if that's the case for other people as
You
well.
don't want to come across as easy.
Exactly, yeah. So, um, but yeah, no, I think what you're doing is amazing in many respects, and it's definitely a model that I hope large numbers of writers will take up. I think it's probably worth pointing out that you have to have, I think, an unusual combination of qualities in order to sort of be a successful Twitter poet. Um, like, what do you think about this? Like, I suspect that there's something to do with the nature of the work. Like, certain poetic forms and approaches will lend themselves to that platform better than others, for one thing. Um, and then there
It's hard
probably
to
has
say
to
what
be,
though.
yeah.
Because
How
I'm
could
I'm
you?
not sure that's true because I've seen all kinds of styles succeed and all kinds fail as well.
Uh-huh. Well, what would be the common points of the ones that succeed, if any?
Well, it's not so much a stylistic thing, but I think you have to be prolific. I think because tweets get buried so quickly, they just fall through the timeline and they're gone. You have to be doing more than one a week. You
Hmm.
can't spend hours and hours working on a poem and then post it and sit back and wait for everyone to love it because it's going to disappear. You're going to have to move on and do something else soon.
I think that's right. There's a guy who produces YouTube videos called Tom Scott. I can't remember what his channel is called. Anyway, he's a British guy who I mean he always wears a red T-shirt, so you can immediately identify him on the thumbnails. Like you always know it's him. And he produces videos, on various topics like incredible places and so on. And they're very catchy little things that you can read in 2 seconds. in the description of the video exactly what it is, and then that's exactly what he'll do. Uh, and there are always these sort of compelling little strange, obscure historical facts and things like that, presented in a very engaging and entertaining way. And he'll do things like he did a video where he traveled to Spitsbergen and Svalbard and just to see what it was like, that kind of thing. And one of the things he said, because his channel has become enormously popular, he's got millions of subscribers, and he's very well known. But he's been at this for a while, and one of the things he said was he just sort of made a game of seeing what could perform really well in social media, just totally experimentally, just without, you just try things. And he said, like, there really is no formula, except you have to just keep throwing things up, and just occasionally, one of them will stick, and you just have to just try a bunch of different things and do it regularly, because, as you said, like the turnover rate is just vastly fast, right? It's things get buried immediately. So to get any kind of a foothold and find some kind of a format that is compelling for people and that they'll be interested in following, there's a certain amount of luck involved, a certain amount of persistence that comes into it. And as you say, that might be irrespective of the style, of the genre. It might be partly a question of timing. It might be partly a question of just regular productivity also, to make sure that there's always something sort of going through the pipeline.
Yeah, I honestly think formatting is more important than the style of poetry. If you can write your poems, I try to write my poems in such a way that they always look the same, so that people will notice them. People who have got an eye out on me will notice it's one of my poems.
That's a form of branding.
Yeah. So, the title in block capitals, and then parentheses, and then lowercase 1 or 2 word description of the poem. And people have said to me that's how they're flicking through and they notice that format. Of course, that only works if they already want to read me.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I probably haven't been very good at personally, and that I admire in other artists. I mean, Kenny Goldsmith. I mean, one of the things that he sort of seems to have figured out very early on in his career was he determined that he needed to have a kind of a log line, like, in other words, a one-line description of the book that would be really simple, that anyone could understand, whatever it was. And it could be something like, I retyped a copy of the New York Times, or I wrote down every word I spoke for a week, or whatever it might be. Like, something incredibly simple and straightforward, and then the book literally just fulfills that to the letter. And there's something to be said for that kind of approach. I really actually admire that a great deal. I love his work. It hasn't worked out for me really so well in terms of my production personally, because I can't summarize one of my pieces in one sentence.
Exactly. It depends what you're doing, doesn't it? There are certain poems of mine I could not describe in anything less than a paragraph.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So but at the same time, I'm conscious of the necessity to, well, let's put it this way. I mean, I do feel very strongly that if you really profound things, really important ideas, are things that you have to be capable of explaining simply. And if you can't explain them in fairly simple and straightforward terms, even if it takes a while to get the point across, but if the terms themselves are not pretty straightforward, then you might not have understood them properly yourself. And so one of the tremendous values of having this channel and engaging with large numbers of people and so on is that it's really forced me to do that, to choose my words carefully, think about how I'm presenting things, and not use any unnecessary complexity or jargon when I'm describing things. I've heard this described as the Eli 5 method, which is explain it to me like I'm 5, which I really like. In other words, nothing more than what is needed to get the point across. And if what is needed to get the point across is a paragraph, then you give them a paragraph. If it's less than that, you give them a sentence. But minimum necessary complexity I think is a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, and of course I've been forced into that by Twitter because you have so few characters to work with.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also interested in like whether the style that you have evolved, this sort of the highly constraint-based type of writing, seems to dovetail particularly well with Twitter somehow in a way that I can't quite put my finger on. I wonder if this is something you've thought about, and if the style of your work has evolved as a consequence of your success on Twitter.
I post a lot of monometer sonnets, and I wrote those because this was when we had only 140 characters to work with. It's quite an interesting challenge to see if you can actually write a sonnet that will fit inside the Twitter box. So that's why I started writing them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gone on to write quite a lot of them because I just enjoy it now. But I initially did it because it was a challenge very specific to Twitter. And I don't know if anyone's noticing, probably not, but whenever I'm writing a tweet and I'm close to 280 characters, I always make sure it's exactly 280 characters.
Oh, right.
That's just a little game I play that no one... I wouldn't blame people if they're not aware of it. Why would they be? So there are things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's an interesting thing. Actually, we should talk about this. It's very interesting knowing when you should respect the feedback of your audience and how you should change yourself depending on your audience. Because on the one hand, like an artist should just do whatever they want and believe in their vision. But you're still human at the end of the day, and you're still going to respond to the way people react to your work. And I think that if I write a certain type of poem on Twitter and I notice that type of poem is getting more attention, I might be more inclined to continue doing those. We can't help but be happy when people respond positively to us.
Yeah, of course. I think that resonance of some kind is necessary. You want the work to exist in the world, right? That for me has always been primordial. It's extremely important. And so one of the things that I've put a great deal of energy into as a composer is ensuring that the pieces that I've wanted to retain, the pieces that I consider to be definitive finished works, they have to be published, they have to be recorded, they have to be performed, and not just performed once, but they have to be performed ideally on an ongoing basis, ideally by multiple ensembles or performers. They have to exist as independent entities in the world and sort of live their own lives, almost as though you were sort of releasing a bacterium that can then sort of multiply itself and invade host species and so on. This is very, very important. And one thing that I've observed is the pieces that are successful in terms of the amount of resonance they seem to create, or the amount of feedback they get, or the number of performances, the number of listeners, and so on. It's very hard for me to predict what those pieces will be, and sometimes I'll write something that I will imagine will get a lot of performances, a wide listenership, and so on, and it won't materialize. And then something else that I'll think, well, this is easily my most bizarre and least approachable piece yet. Nobody's gonna, it's gonna have a very restricted amount of success, and then I'll be proven completely wrong. And it's very hard for me to figure out.
It's surprising, isn't it?
Yeah.
The thing about posting poems on Twitter is that because quite often I'm thinking about my next collection, I will post poems that I think are going to go with my next book, and then I'm quite anxious waiting to see how people respond to them. I find though that there are some, if there's a poem I really like, it doesn't matter if it does well or not. If I really like it, that's going in the book. And if there's one I don't really like at all, but it suddenly does really well on Twitter, still it's not going in the book. But then there's that area in between, and it's definitely influenced what I've used. If I'm not sure about something, then I think, okay, well let's give it to the public. Let's see what they think.
Right. Yeah, I can relate to that. I mean, I what I do is I try to make sure that whatever the idea is in the piece, or whatever the impulse, the thing that I'm trying to create, I try to do that in as clear and as powerful and as straightforward a fashion as I possibly can, so that the idea has or the work has a maximal chance, like you maximize its chances uh, of creating an impact of some kind. But once you've done that, I think the rest is really up to the audience to determine. Um, so you try to give it the best possible circumstances of birth, and give it a kind of a red carpet type of situation. Present it as well as you can, and then you see what happens. Um, and I'm very often surprised by what happens.
Yeah, no artist's personal favorite work of theirs is their most popular.
Yeah, I think that's true. Um, I wouldn't say that the pieces that have been particularly successful have then made me think, oh well, I'll try to do more things in this direction. And I think once again that connects to a difference between poetry and music, which is in the sense that the lag in terms of publication is much longer, or public dissemination, let's say, is much longer in music than it tends to be in poetry. So what I mean by that is, and in my case, that lag has sometimes been quite extreme. So the first few years that I was living in Paris, I wrote a series of pieces that were completely utopian in almost every respect of their production. Instrumentation, the difficulty, the complexity of the piece, the amount of rehearsal time that they would require, and so on. The instruments that I would use. These were pieces that, in all practicality, had slim to no chance of actually being performed, especially in the circumstances that I was in at the time, which was a completely unknown sort of penniless composer living in Paris with very few contacts. It's like, well, but I wrote them anyway with the thinking, the hope that eventually it would become possible for them to be played. And you hope, of course, that eventually will be sooner rather than later, but you're willing to take a gamble on that. In the case of some of those pieces, I was waiting 8 years, 10 years before they were actually finally made public. So that is a very, very substantial lag between the time when you're actually working on the thing to when it actually achieves some kind of public dissemination. It's really much too long. I wouldn't want that to be the case. That's how it happened. Even today, I mean, like all of my pieces now, pretty much with very few exceptions, are commissioned, publicly commissioned, or privately commissioned, or whatever it might be. And the premiere date is set usually a couple of years ahead of when I start working on it. So it's much more highly professionalized than it would have been 15 years ago or more. But even there, I mean, the lag between when I'm working on something and when it finally is performed and recorded and published, it's going to be several years, usually. And that's a frustrating thing. If you're an artist and you have the sensation that your work is evolving quickly, you're excited with what you're working on, you want people to hear it right away, and you can't. You have to wait 3 years. Like, imagine if you wrote a poem and you had to wait 3 years before you could post it on Twitter.
Well, that's another way Twitter's changed things. I mean, I would find it very difficult. I think I find that difficult anyway. That sort of timescale. But especially now, having had the experience of being able to write something and just think, okay, let's see what people think. Let's throw it out there. Now that I've been able to do that, I mean, I don't really send poems to journals anymore because I can't wait a month for the response.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much I can do in that direction, because the way that I work, I mean, I write instrumental music and it has to be performed and rehearsed, and then in order to have a recording that I would want to share, it has to be reasonably well performed and rehearsed. and then it has to be recorded, and all of this takes time and money and so on, and resources and a lot of planning. So what I can do is I can sort of share snapshots of the creative process, which I'm a little bit torn about that, because on the one hand I'm very reticent to show anything less than a finished work, but at the same time I acknowledge that there is a level of public interest in the sort of creative process. Like my most successful tweets and Instagram posts and all of those sort of things, without exception, it's always a snapshot of a manuscript or of a work in progress. Those will get a 3 to 4-fold increase in their sort of statistic numbers. I don't exactly understand why that is, but there seems to be interest, so I occasionally keep doing it. And that is one thing that I can do that is relatively instantaneous. I'll be sitting down working on a manuscript, and I'll just take a shot of the page, post it, and then instantly get people commenting on it, and that's kind of interesting.
It's important to be seen to be active, I think. I took a not even quite a week off Twitter recently, and I lost about 20 followers in that week.
Really?
Just because I wasn't active. Yeah. That's my fickle public.
That's appalling.
Bastards. Yeah, you have to I think prove to people that you are constantly doing things, that you're still relevant, you're still creating. Any small thing you can do that shows that's just you waving, saying, "Look, hi, I'm still here."
I think it might be even more crucial in my case, just because the amount of time that it takes to complete a project and for that project to be made public is substantial, and it's like way out of step with the sort of time frame of social media. That's for sure. Like you can't hold people's attention over the course of the 4 years that it might take to, from the initial idea, the initial conception for a piece to when it's actually made fully available.
Have you thought about writing things specifically for Twitter? Like you could just do a 20-second miniature, for example. Something that would take you a few minutes to write, and you could just say, "This is the kind of thing I do."
Yeah, I have thought about that, but it's very difficult to square with my practice. Where see, the problem is with what I'm doing, even a 20-second clip, that could take me a day. That could take me a full work day, depending on what it was. I'm not making any claims as to the quality, but the level of trying to think of the word. Okay, there's a word in French, exigence, that it perfectly expresses what I'm trying to say. There's no exact equivalent. I suppose it means the demands that you're making, the level that you're setting, how high you set the bar, let's say. What you're expecting of yourself I place that level extremely high. So it makes it hard to whip off something in 20 seconds. Partly because if the level of effort and intensity of engagement is not set at a very high level, it's hard for me to hold my interest. So I don't know that I would be interested enough to want to do something. To want to make something public that I would be capable of doing in 10 minutes, let's say. But I have a great deal of respect for artists who are able to do that and able to produce things that are compelling in that manner. So, for example, a painter I really like is Robert Motherwell, who's one of the abstract expressionists, and he created a long series of paintings called the Lyric Suite, which he made on Japanese paper. And he discovered that when you paint on Japanese paper, there's a very high level of bleed. Like the ink will bleed into the paper, and so it's very difficult to control the spread of the ink once you've done that, once you've made a mark. And he would make these gestural paintings that are, I think, incredibly beautiful, but like, these are things that he would make in the space of maybe 20 seconds. Like there might be 2 or 3 lines done in a very, very particular way with certain colors, certain gestures, and then that's it. You can't change it afterwards. You can't modify it. You can't control the spread of ink. It produces what it produces, and there it is. It's this like little infinitely slender little moment of time that's been sort of captured and turned into this little fleeting expression. He was very good at that, and made hundreds of these, and they're really exquisite little paintings. That's something that I'm not able to do. It's never been compatible with my approach, neither in poetry, in the books of poetry I've published, or in the music that I write. Everything is just enormously labor intensive. Just costs me thousands of hours, untold thousands of hours of work to produce something. That's just how it is. I'm neither, positive or negative on that question. It seems to be somehow intrinsic to the nature of what I do.
And it's interesting. So I always think people need some sort of freedom to go with the constraints. Like I write very impulsively, and I decide I'm going to do something, and I sit there for hours and working on it, and then I'm spent and I get drunk. You seem to be very methodical in every aspect of your work.
Yeah, I read a book a few years ago by David Foster Wallace called The Pale King. It was actually the book he was working on when he died, and it's a novel. And what it's about, I have to say, I read very few novels, but I did read this one, and I really liked it. And it's about a group of accountants, and it's a very peculiar book in many respects, because he takes the most deliberately boring subject matter imaginable and turns it into this sort of riveting meditation on meaning and human purpose, and it's an incredibly interesting book. And one of the things he does is he demonstrates that through the sort of setting up of these very highly circumscribed tasks that are very specific, and then their meticulous fulfillment through whatever it might be, the highly conscientious filling out of a particular tax form, and the knowledge of this incredibly complicated tax code, let's say, and all of the tools of the trade and how all of this is done, and the sort of type of person is sort of type of highly conscientious, highly structured person that you would need in order to fulfill this type of job year after year. That there's a kind of tremendous dignity in that. It's an odd book in many respects. I really enjoyed it, and that really resonated with me in some respects, because I really see myself as an accountant in a certain respect, as a person who exercises a profession and who works in a sort of meticulously organized studio according to set hours, and attempts at least to bring to bear a kind of analytical precision, surgical precision, and an intensity of focus to what they're doing, as though it were on a level with carrying out some kind of complicated neurosurgery. In other words, there are real stakes involved. You don't want to mess up the piece. It would be very bad for the world if the piece did not get born properly the way it's meant to. And someone who single-mindedly focuses every day on this job and does it as well as they can. And that's the sort of person that I try to be. And
but at the same time, there's your music and your poetry, definitely. There's a huge sense of fun in there. I don't get the feeling you're taking yourself very seriously all the time.
Well, there's a quote I really like, It's from a 19th century French poet, and I can't at this hour remember exactly who it was. It might have been Mallarmé. It might have been someone else. Uh, Along the lines that it's a good thing to aspire to be kind of boring and predictable and regular in terms of the sort of external trappings of your life, so that you can be completely wild and insane and free and unhinged in your creative work. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Now, what he specifically meant by this, I believe, was, aim for a bourgeois lifestyle. You have a house, you're married, you have a kind of a settled private life, and you don't have to sort of worry about those things. They're in place. And then once you've got this sort of bourgeois facade, and you wear a suit and all of that kind of thing, and you then you can create this completely insane artwork. That idea I've always actually found quite appealing, where you have a kind of external appearance of sort of regularity, responsibility, and reliability. And then on the inside, it's like this molten flow of one insane idea after the other. I love the contrast between those two things. I find it doesn't work very well to pursue a chaotic, bohemian, unhinged life.
I don't know. I'm trying to think about my I live my life. That felt like a lecture, Samuel.
It's all in good fun. Yeah, I mean, this is a question of temperament, but something always resonated in me, like the figure of the sort of professional wearing a lab coat, who would be in the lab at 8 o'clock in the morning, with their clipboard, and their spotless shoes and so on, and working on a complicated problem, and then going home. Somehow, I really like that idea. So there you have it.
I've said that I ended up as a poet because I'm a failed rock star and a failed scientist. So I understand that, I put those two things together.
Yeah. So look, a lot of these things are irreducible. It's a product of your personality and your inclinations, I suppose. But I'm glad anyway. I'm very flattered to hear that you think that the work projects a sense of fun, because I find it incredibly fun to do. So I hope that some of that comes across. If the work itself were ever to be seen as being in some manner formulaic or boring or repetitive, then I would really rather do something else.
And I think again, you've done a tweet recently about a lot of contemporary music being, or not having enough of a sense of fun.
Oh yeah, that's a huge problem in the contemporary music world. It does tend to take itself incredibly seriously. It's one thing to take yourself incredibly seriously if you are burdened with a tremendous responsibility, and if the actions that you undertake within your field have gigantic and far-reaching consequences. It's another thing altogether to take yourself seriously if you're one of 200,000 composers, sort of trying to eke out a living in the sort of bottom ranks of the profession, getting an opportunity here or there when you can, and producing work that has very little public impact. If you see what I mean, it's like, if that's the situation, then you might as well try to have some fun and do things like, it's like you have to figure you don't have that much to lose, so you might as well take some risks, enjoy yourself, and see what happens. So taking myself overly seriously just doesn't enter into that, and I'm well aware of the marginal nature of a lot of what I do. Also, the fact that this is objectively strange sounding work to a lot of people. I realized that. So
At least you've got poetry to fall back on.
yeah, exactly. If it doesn't work out with the poetry, uh, with the music. Yeah, yeah. There's a hilarious comment by Leonard Cohen, who had published a number of novels and poetry collections throughout his 20s and 30s that failed to attract much of a readership. I think he was in very desperate financial circumstances by that point. And he joked about the fact that he attempted to solve his professional dilemma as a poet by becoming a folk singer. Given that he couldn't really sing and couldn't really play the guitar, it's like that was the best career move that he could think of. And as it turns out, it was wildly successful. Well, but it was just it actually worked. Yeah, but that was not the expected outcome.
We haven't talked about you as a poet that much. You're still writing poetry.
Absolutely.
When was the last? What year was it? The last book?
The last book came out in 2015.
So we're five years in to your work on a new one. How close is it to being completed?
I'm not sure it can be completed. I think that what is likelier to happen is the work will be abandoned and published in a provisional state, because the nature of the project is such that completion is an unlikely outcome. I'm not even sure it's a viable goal. And this has been a natural progression in the writing I've done over the past 10 years or so, sort of tending more towards that direction. And when I started this new project, I had the idea that with extreme effort, I could still pull it together into something resembling a coherent, finished book. As I advance with this project, I'm starting to have doubts as to whether that's in fact possible.
Well, I hope you finish it. I like what I've read of it so far.
It doesn't
should exist.
It doesn't mean I'll never publish it. It just means that when it does get published, it may be in a sort of visibly unfinished form. Or it'll be a massive torso or fragment.
And what are you working on now, music-wise? Is there anything you want to plug?
Well, I have a new CD actually that just came out.
There we are.
A few days ago. Yeah. So that's, well, it's new and it isn't new. It's a new CD. It's a new recording, but some of the pieces on there are 18 years old. So it's a strange thing for me to have things that go back fairly far in my output be released as though for the first time, and people are discovering them for the first time. But that's how it has gone for me as an artist. I mean, there are very significant time lags in my production a lot of the time. So that's out. I'm very, very proud of this CD, very pleased with it. I hope a lot of people hear it. It's called Iridescent Notation, and it was released by Kairos out of Vienna. And that will be available worldwide as a physical CD, but also widely available on Spotify, iTunes, and Apple Music and other platforms. And besides that, I am struggling to complete a major orchestral piece. It's a violin concerto, and this was a piece that I actually finished a first version of in 2018, and that first version already cost me a year of effort. I wasn't happy with it, and I set back to work on it, completely rewrote it. It's now a substantially better piece. It's also quite new. And I've had to spend 8 months on the second version of that piece. So if all goes according to plan, it will be performed in September and recorded shortly thereafter.
Samuel, we've been talking for 2.5 hours. This might have to be a 2-part podcast. But it's always good talking to you. So I don't know how I'm going to edit this down to anything. I'll manage it. I'll figure it out.
You've been incredibly patient and indulgent with my ramblings, and I, as ever, appreciate the the platform and your willingness to have me on. I really appreciate that.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.